All right, I'm going to kick us off. I have just a couple of introductory things before I introduce our speaker, Roberto, who we are very happy to have joining us here live and in person from Sydney, Australia. So I guess you're actually in tomorrow already. So we've got a guest from the future. For those of you who don't know, this is a seminar series hosted by the Learning Analytics Research Network here at NYU. We're a network across the university who many of you have been a part of for some time, and we're working to build the future of data-informed teaching and learning research. We do this in a variety of ways, including bringing in exciting speakers like Roberto to talk to us about the great work they're doing around the world. Just a couple other upcoming events. For those of you at NYU, the next two events we have are internal events, and they're with NYU IT, looking at the kinds of data that would be useful to inform teaching and how we might get those in our new upcoming LMS. And then Wednesday, November 18th, we're very excited to have Carolyn Rosé join us to talk about the next frontier of AI-enabled collaborative learning. Carolyn Rosé is at Carnegie Mellon and doing some really exciting work with natural language processing of student talk and collaboration. One other thing I want to share, released hot off the presses yesterday, for those of you who were at our recent session on college in the time of Corona, we did a survey of about 300 students last spring to understand how they were experiencing the transition to online learning. And the report came out yesterday. There's some really interesting findings. There's some differences we found between men and women, undergraduates and graduates, how people's experience changed over time, their feelings, and the specific kinds of teaching techniques that they felt were effective and what things they'd want to see change. So anyone who's involved in that, feel free to go to our website, or there's the direct link right there. And if you want to know more about what we're doing after this talk, Roberto, piques your interest, feel free to go to our website to learn all about the different projects, applications, and other events we'll be hosting. So without further ado, I want to introduce our guest speaker, Dr. Roberto Martinez-Maldonado. He's going to be speaking us today. There he is waiting. Hi, Roberto.
Hello.
We'll give you the warmest welcome possible in what is a very cold Zoom room. Roberto's going to be speaking to us today on multimodal data stories to support reflection in clinical simulation. And I think this is a really exciting topic because it brings together two streams of research he's been working on and is well known for in the field for quite some time. So Roberto is a senior lecturer of learning analytics and human-computer interaction in the Faculty of Information Technologies at Monash University in Melbourne. So he was smart enough to slip up to Sydney. His research aims to co-create strategies and enabling technologies with educational stakeholders to support teaching and learning across physical and digital spaces. His developments are particularly focused on creating data-intensive solutions that enable learners and educators to interact with artificial intelligent outputs and data visualizations meaningfully. And in this work, he brings together two different streams. One, which is multimodal learning analytics, which is about capturing all sorts of different learning traces besides just clicks, a whole variety of interesting things, which is going to be important for this work that he's doing with nursing students in clinical simulation. He's also working with them and really bringing the humans into the process, which is another thing he's known for. And finally, he's talking about multimodal data stories, and this notion of storytelling really connects into the human element of how humans think with data. So this is some really innovative work. I think it's even beyond where I've heard him talk about it before, and we're very excited to hear you speak. So with that, I will cut my screen, say welcome, and hand it over to you, Roberto.
First, I mute myself. Yeah, thank you very much. Thanks so much for this invitation. I know that I was supposed to be there before COVID struck, or just in March when things were unfolding. So I'm really happy and I really appreciate the opportunity to participate with you, even remotely, a few months after. And I'm going to go straight to the focus of the talk, because there are quite a few topics I would like to cover to communicate the key message. And I would like to acknowledge, first of all, that this is work that I did with my awesome PhD students and with Professor Simon Buckingham-Shum in the University of Technology of Sydney, where I used to work last year. But we keep working just remotely, same country, so it's been easy. So I teach data visualization, and I like metaphors in data visualization. And I used to use this metaphor with my students that were doing data science. I was telling them, okay, imagine that data are just a bunch of oysters. Think of, you have thousands of oysters, and your mission is to find the oysters, wild oysters, to find the pearls in those oysters. So there's a fact there that in wild oyster, it's really hard to find a pearl. This is very random, so you need to open 10,000s of wild oysters to find an actual pearl. And then once you find it, it's precious, right? So you want to give it to someone special, you wrap it and you sell it, very expensive. So imagine now that, because we're talking about the oysters as data, the pearls are the insights. In data mining, in learn analytics, we are very focused and very, we treat these pearls very preciously. And actually there's a very nice paper in the Journal of Learn Analytics that defines what an actionable insight is. And this is defining pretty much what we're trying to do in Learn Analytics, which is closing the loop, helping teachers and learners, not just trying to find the pearls and do something, write a paper, but actually helping teachers and students. So having that in mind, at the same time, we already know that the pearls we find are of different quality. The data we have is messy. So many oysters is messy, and sometimes it's sometimes easy to find pearls from data that we have at hand. For example, the dashboards in the LMS. We have some data, some clicks, and it's easy to create a dashboard and just show these charts because they look beautiful, but maybe we're missing the point. And this is a very nice paper by Kirsty Quito and authors and co-authors that talks about that issue. Sometimes we don't know what to focus on. So a critical question is how to come from data, from messy data to insights in Learn Analytics. And I know that Alicia and her team are working and are doing awesome work on human-centered design. So this is sitting with teachers and students and really understanding what are their needs, right? And this is the spirit of human-centered design as a whole discipline that is starting to make an impact in Learn Analytics. The purpose is knowing the culture. And if we're going to design any technology, we design it in context of that culture for educational culture, which is very specific, right? And it's very different to user-centered design. I'm not gonna deep dive into this topic, but I just wanted to make the differentiation. And this is from a very strong foundational paper that defines what co-creation is, what is human-centered design. So user-centered design, if you see it in some papers, usually refers to observing the users. The researcher does the whole process of getting the insights and reporting and building a tool, bringing the theory. But co-creation or co-design is actually sitting with users, with developers, the researchers, all the different stakeholders, and creating something as partners in this process. It's time consuming, but it's worth it. And for us, in doing that, we understood that we needed to go beyond charts and just displaying nice figures and dashboards. And we understood, no, students are talking about stories. The teachers are talking about stories. And storytelling is a basic human skill that has been used for thousands of years to communicate insights. Sometimes precious insights are wrapped around the story. And that's the way in which we communicate as humans and we understand those insights. So that's why we brought the idea of data stories. I'm gonna go back to data stories in a minute. Why we needed this idea of telling stories instead of communicating data? Well, in UTS, in the University of Technology of Sydney, we have one of the probably is the top nursing school in the country. And they have these classrooms with mannequins, and they are present in several schools as well, in hospitals, for training, for running simulation-based learning in teams, and these are really complex learning settings. And I think some people in the audience are much experts than me in these kind of scenarios, and they know that every simulation can be very complex. It can deal with lots of knowledge that is required, lots of skills that are required to accomplish different tasks. And the idea is that this is a safe environment. And the teachers here wanted to enhance the way evidence was collected. So many things were happening. Some, for example, clinical errors could be happening, and there were missing opportunities in these scenarios if these errors were not detected, for example. So here we're talking about multimodality. Students were interacting not just with a computer and in the LMS and typing and clicking, but they needed to embody their learning. They had to interact with other people. They had to talk with team members and also interact with these mannequins and also other medical instruments. So we're talking about multimodal data. We are going to collect evidence. We're talking immediately about multiple sources of evidence. And then we want to also come from these multimodal data into data stories. And what I'm going to show is most of the work that I'm going to talk about today was published recently in CHI, Conference of Human Factors in Computing. They're interested about education quite recently as well. And why we want to tell stories instead of communicating data? There's another big reason. I believe, and I know that we can have a discussion about this, but students and teachers generally are non-data experts. And actually there's a very interesting piece, data visualization literacy, I copied below in this slide, in which they did this investigation of, okay, let's see how STEM undergrads, which you already have a background understanding charts and figures, how can they interpret charts in data visualization? And the results were really low. They cannot even interpret sometimes the charts that the lecturer is showing to them and explaining in a slide during the lectures. So imagine to just put charts in front of students. That's most likely it's not going to work. So I'm just going to, in one slide, going to just talk about the process of the co-design with students and teachers. This was some work led by Carlos from a PhD student. And he brought all his knowledge on co-designing with underrepresented communities to learn analytics, to co-design with the students, particularly. And enabling students, in this case, he was using a technique called the learner data journeys to represent, okay, here's where I need the feedback, this is information, here's where I struggle, here is where I usually don't know what to do, and so on. And it was a very interesting dialogue between students and teachers that he could record. And so pretty much the outputs I'm going to show you after is the result of this process. Vanessa Chiberry is another student who also brought a different perspective to co-design, which was, okay, let's interact with teachers to know how to come from very low sensor data to constructs, to higher order constructs. Like, for example, how can we come from microphone data, from positioning data, from wristband data into constructs that are related with teamwork? And because teachers can talk about, okay, if I see two people speaking, maybe there's some coordination here in this phase of the simulation. There are going to be lots of holes. So what she did was to bring theory on teamwork, team theory, to complete those holes and start to map from this low level data to those constructs. So, but let's roll back. I'm starting to talk about multimodal data. This division that we had. We had these students sometimes working in small teams, just focus on one bed, and these things are being video recorded. There's one teacher. That's the premium attention for some teams. And this is what happens sometimes in hospitals, premium simulation versus an actual classroom where we have like 5 teams at the same time, just one teacher, and so many things that are going on. So we wanted to capture these data traces using microphones, localization sensors, and wristbands. The wristbands especially to understand how the students are reacting in terms of stress or arousal, because this is sometimes they are facing stressful situations. And part of the task is at the end, they have the debrief. This is a signature pedagogy. This is critical for simulation-based learning, to have a debrief in which sometimes it's even longer than the actual simulation, and where the nurses reflect. And I know that you're doing work in this area from Alicia's slide at the beginning, in which they have to reflect on what's going on, how they felt, even their feelings, their stress, the errors that maybe they made, the lack of communication in the team, lack of coordination, etc. And the idea is to use evidence, so to provide evidence so these reflections can go deeper. The kind of data, just as a bit of background, is a lot of data, even just from one sensor. We have electrodermal activity, heartbeat, temperature. From localization sensors, we have where each nurse is at each time, the rotation of the body, where the teacher is in relationship with the nurses. And also we have logs from system logs. We also have an observation console. So that this obviously gives a lot of context. It's not just sensor data, but it's actually meaningful information about who is doing what. So here we have, you remember the oysters? Well, we have bags of oysters. We have different sources of data. This is the multimodal data. And there's complexity here. So we get one pearl from one of these bags. Maybe it doesn't make sense. You need to have a bunch of pearls. Anyway, so I'm going to put an example, and I like the indoor localization data because it's very simple. And then when we convert it into something more meaningful, it actually gains lots of meaning. So in this case, we only have, imagine we have only coordinates in the indoor space. But there are positions around the bed that are important for certain tasks. For example, for a CPR, where someone is falling into cardiac arrest, someone needs to be at the bed head behind the patient to hold the head and do a bagging or another technique, while someone else is applying compressions on the chest of the patient. So there's coordination, there's the use of space, and this needs to happen in a coordinated way. And students need to be in certain positions at certain times. So what we did was to convert all this sensor data into a more discrete data representation that could help us to extract these pearls. And we did based on, or inspired by the book of quantitative ethnography of David Shepard. And we call this the multimodal matrix, because instead of having sensor data of X and Y positions, we started, for example, for the physical positioning, to identify where each nurse is around the bed on this, using this scheme of areas of interest. So we don't deal with coordinates anymore. We did with these positions that carry meaning. And we did something similar also for arousal data. If is in this particular time, is this particular student aroused? Is it experiencing stress? No, and so on. We have different data representations for each sensor. And well, these can directly be plotted into these diagrams. We just have this we have this matrix, and that can be just plotted, and we can count the ones and the zeros, right? So this is one example of what we did. We created this proxy of just diagram of states on the right of what was happening on the left in a CPR situation. So someone was in the bagging area, someone was on top of the patient, and the other one was next to it, close to the trolley. But this is not telling any story. It's just like, even if I show this to you, it's like, okay, how can I interpret this? How can I make it actionable? So, and obviously we can, we need to understand what's the learner design, the learning design. What are the the things that are important from the teacher perspective. So here's when we started to create these data stories. When we started to extract from the teacher, okay, the compression depth should be between 5 and 6 centimeters. A nurse should be located at the top of the bed. Nurses should show any arousal state, some arousal state during the activity. These were started to be kind of rules that were extracted from the teacher. And this is what the teacher does when assessing these kind of simulations. And we came up with after a few attempts, with one very simple approach, and we call it the timeline of actions, where we have pretty much all the actions that each nurse did during the simulation. In this case, just for to make it easier, my presentation, it shows the simpler group with two nurses. And what we see here is a visualization that invites you to explore the actions, right? This is commonly aimed at people with some data analysis expert. In this case, this visualization is simple, so you don't need strong data analysis expert, but you need a lot of willingness to try to understand and go through all the story and reconstruct what happened. We call this the vanilla version, just because it doesn't have any enhancement that invites for, or is not telling any story. So we started to test with different prototypes. This is one study that we did with teachers based on a CPR on a cardiac arrest situation. We took this vanilla timeline and we enhanced it with different, what we call data storytelling elements. In this case, it's already assessing what's happening, assessing the actions and providing some more insights about what's happening in this particular simulation for these teams. For example, in this case, the team reacted slowly. There's a little bit of assessment of the actions. So it was not just showing actions, but saying here between when the patient fell into cardiac arrest and when the compressions were given, 1.23 minutes happened. So this is a bit low, it's low. So, you know, that's a life and death situation. And it's good for students to see this and visualize it now that they are working with a mannequin patient. And obviously these rules come from, these enhancements automatically can be generated based on rules. So we translated the learning intention from the teacher into if and then and functions, if then rules and functions that trigger certain things on the visualization. So in this way, we can highlight certain data points that are important. We add a title that already communicates part of the insight, so the students don't need to go through all the data points. Adding different closures. We have this notion of layers, so they can start adding information, for example, about arousal. And also we had an option to disclose the rules, especially for the teachers, to know how these things were calculated. So this was our first attempt, and then we went to a classroom to show this to actual students. And in this case, it was a totally different simulation. That's another thing, you know, you start focusing on a different simulation. It's a totally different learning design, a different world, different things that are important to highlight. In this case, for example, there was a situation in which a patient is coming out from surgery and is still having some problems, especially with an antibiotic, and it has a bad reaction, an adverse reaction to an antibiotic. And these are the rules of what the teacher is expecting from these students to do: assess vital signs every 10 minutes, administer, and then realizing that the antibiotic is causing an adverse effect, stopping it at a time, immediately, if possible, perform an ECG afterwards, call to the doctor because this is a serious potential life-threatening situation if it's escalated. So in this case, we have teams that are larger. In this case, we have 4 nurses. And in this case, what we did was transforming each of these learning intentions of the teacher into buttons in an interface, which are the bottom of the visualization. And again, we have all the actions, and imagine these are all the oysters, all the different actions that were captured. But where are these stories? So what can we tell? You need pretty much a teacher to be navigating this and spending some time to understand what's going on. So we're trying to facilitate that. And if the teacher is already saying the students need to check the vital signs every 10 minutes, then we can do that automatically, assess that, and provide a message. So it's not the visualization, but it's also the narrative that is around and saying, providing already informative feedback, at least descriptive. You miss assessing vital signs, and that's important. But also highlighting the things that were done correctly, stopping the FEV fluid immediately, but they didn't perform the ECG. So imagine if we can capture this information for the 5 beds that were in that classroom, we can start to think about different representations for the teacher to provide feedback on the things that were missed by most of the students. And also we started to find ways to represent the arousal data in different ways. In this case, it's the team in general was very aroused by the end of the simulation. So during the debrief, they could speak about this. Or some students, sometimes they don't have any arousal. So maybe they can talk about how realistic they felt the simulation was, or if they were disengaged, and this has been happening as well. We validated these visualizations and these prototypes with students and teachers. The teachers I've been working with, some were our old collaborators and some others were new. And the good thing is they never thought that we could try to tell stories with this data. So for them, they thought that this was something they could actually use. And also they could use as case studies, not necessarily collecting the data, but if this data was collected, they could also use it as a case study for the teaching. And there are things that they cannot see as well. For example, the depth of the compressions. They cannot just be checking all the time, monitoring that information. So if there's a way to automatically assess all this information coming from the mannequin, from the sensors, it can help them to pick things that are important. For a student's perspective as well, they were saying, oh, this is really good to divide the data into sections. This is how they represent what we call the layers or the data stories. So they felt that there was a scaffolding in the reflections when they were looking at their own data. And they were also interested in being assessed, in nursing. At least there are certain things that are right and that can be right or wrong. So they wanted to know, okay, this was wrong. This was a wrong procedure. Or for us, I think pedagogically, we want to spark discussion about things that may be wrong with the teacher. So the intention is for the teacher to be, this is how they conduct the debriefs. The teacher is there during the debrief. So if they can collaboratively reflect with this interface, there is room for that discussion to happen. Also, for the teachers, some of them were very, very interested about the kind of evidence that can be collected. Sometimes they have to just provide feedback based on what they see, and they don't know exactly the details about how the performance of the students. So one of them, for example, said, now I can give feedback based on evidence, make bolder statements when providing that feedback. That cannot be easily disputed. So you didn't do that. And some students can say, yes, we did, but we have the evidence that didn't happen. And that's important. And it happens in the classrooms that even we observe. And also, they talk about the algorithmic transparency. We were opening the rules that we use to highlight things, and they really liked that because some of them were saying, I would like to manipulate those rules because maybe we can give feedback differently to first-year students compared to final year students. And while others were saying, no, it's good for first-year students to even see these rules because that's where they need to aim for by the end of their degree. And here is 3 years. The degree is only 3 years. I don't know how it's in the United States. This is a short time. And for students, they were not interested in the algorithm expected. So they were saying, well, it's good to see it, but not to manipulate or do anything. Teachers should do that. So that's pretty much it. I just wanted to wrap up now with the main ideas. What we're aiming for is to reduce complexity, especially when talking about this multimodal data. We are at the moment working on other sources of data. I mean, we can spend a couple of years just working, for example, on positioning data. I didn't explain much in this presentation, but that's something as well that we are investigating. But in the end, what we are trying to do is to not only discover patterns that may be interesting for research, but to reduce complexity and try to feed back something to students and teachers. And in this scenario, particularly, we focus on providing objective evidence that can facilitate that reflection. Indirectly as well, showing this data to teachers, that this data they never had about their simulations, is sparking changes in the instructional design, particularly not telling too much, not disclosing too much to students of what is expected from them. Sometimes they see, oh, all the students are doing this, but sometimes they don't think about it. It's just because they are being instructed. So this is even a change in the pedagogy. Maybe they're aiming to explore productive failure pedagogies, in which the students just go into a full immersive simulation and they make all the mistakes. And then the data can be collected in order to highlight those mistakes and do it again. And here we are talking as well about pretty much context-specific analytics, which is an area of discussion. If we want analytics to be this contextualized to this level, or we need general analytics that are not necessarily related to the particular context, but can be relevant for a family of simulations, which is what we think is in our case. Some of the approaches can be tweaked in a subtle way to work for a family of simulations, for example. But obviously in trying to change the interface and trying to doing an actual assessment of the data and presenting narrative automatically, or highlighting data points and downstating some other data points, sending them to the background. There's a risk of bias because we're making decisions, right? There are design decisions that can carry these commitments already. And there's also a risk of false negatives. So what happens if one particular critical action is not highlighted? You know, this can bring all this discussion as well. And also there is the potential risk of using this tool for summative assessment. That's something we don't want to happen, but we need to design for making sure that the tool is used in this context of a dialogue, of a feedback dialogue loop between teachers and students. And also we touch on aspects like algorithmic transparency, disclosing the rules that are being used for highlighting things in the interface. And also other things came as a result of these studies in terms of, okay, how do you identify the data? How do you use it in the classroom? If we're using sensors and we cannot put sensors on all the students, how are we going to show these interfaces not to cause embarrassment and other people judging what others are doing? So there's lots of information here. So yeah, pretty much thank you so much. I think we can have some time for some interesting discussion, questions, or comments if you didn't like it as well. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks so much, Roberto. So I will give you an in-person clap. Everyone else, feel free to express your appreciation as possible through the chat or the clap icon. If you want to stop sharing your screen, Roberto, I think we have a little bit of time for questions. I mean, I found that fascinating and mind-blowing, so there's lots of things I want to ask, but let me start off by giving other people a chance. you can either click the hand raise button in the participants tab, or if you want, you can also just raise your hand in real space, and we'll just, whoever wants to speak can ask some questions. Okay, I think we've got a question from Javier. I think you should be able to just unmute yourself, but let me know if you, perfect.
Hola, Roberto. As always, a pleasure to hear you talk and also to see the work of Vanessa. That's pretty impressive. I have a question, and it's related to this idea of storytelling, that sometimes as teachers, when we are reviewing the work of the students, there is this serendipity on teaching moments, on something that maybe we didn't send the work or we planned the work to evaluate something, but at that moment, it just happened, and you just use that as an excuse to teach something. When you are basing your evaluation on these rules, that these things to happen, in which place you can insert this, oh, by the way, you did this, but was not the objective of the lesson, but you should take into account this external, or this additional thing.
Yeah, definitely. That's a really important question, Javier, because, what we do is to kind of restricting beforehand, based on the design, what are the kind of things that the students need to focus on. But yeah, I totally agree that teachers may find out that particular groups of students may need to first fix certain things, very basic, that are not even relevant if for the other kind of higher learning intentions that the teacher may have beforehand. So pretty much the feedback is usually adapted to the level of the students, right? So yeah, I mean, at the moment we don't have a technical solution for that, but at the same time, I don't think is something not everything needs to be solved with technology, especially this data storytelling. I think there are things that can happen just without the technology or design perspective of highlighting things. But sometimes you can have a very simple visualization, and then the that storytelling happens externally, facilitated by the educator, for example. So that's why we think, particularly for this simulation-based learning in nursing or in clinical settings, we see that there is a signature pedagogy that learning analytics can exploit, or that learning analytics can contribute to, which is this debrief is an opportunity for learning analytics that doesn't happen for many other areas, where there is time in which reflection is the focus. So we see that this tool can just play a partial role there, and the teacher has the chance to talk about a number of other things, which is what they already do. I don't think they're going to stop talking about things like, hey guys, don't speak in front of the patient. We couldn't capture that, for example, but the teacher maybe knows, and you can just keep the reflection going. So I think we don't see this tool as a substitute of the teacher, but it's more like an additional tool to be there in that dialogue between the teachers and the students. Yeah, I think Fabio is raising a real hand.
Okay, go ahead, Fabio, and after that, I've got a question in the chat that I'll read out.
Thanks, Elisa. Hey, Roberto, how are you?
Very good, Fabio.
So I have a methods-related question. How did you test your prototypes with the users, and how did you ensure they were going to give you valid answers and not just say, oh, I love this because this is different from like my regular common dashboard? Thanks.
Yeah, we use a protocol. We put together this protocol. How do we call it? I have it here. I don't remember the name, but there's an acronym. But the idea is that we bring this framework of translucence, or designing for translucence, in which we have questions like, what's the added value, or if there is any value in showing you this information. And obviously, there's the novelty effect, and it's like, oh yeah, because that's compared with having no data. right? But we also start to investigate things like the ideation. Okay, how do you really think you're going to use this in the classroom? And here's when we start to get very valuable information, because they start to think about all the restrictions in the current practice. And for us, that's very qualitative, obviously, but that is when they start to think about, okay, yeah, I can use this tool, but can you have sensors for everyone? If not, then I cannot use it, because I'm not going to put some students in disadvantage. Okay, at least well, maybe we can have this kind of data for all of them, and we just focus on this in the classroom, and then you send information to them particularly for that team. Or they start to think about the orchestration of the tool, orchestration of the tool, and also the practice, the teaching. And in that protocol, we also ask questions about what we call translucency, transparency, about data ownership, about the identification. So we get kind of different information, not necessarily evaluating the tool, but more for design purposes. So because we have been focusing on design, and I think you as well, guys, have been working lots on how to design for that use. So for me, that's a little bit more valuable than, at least at this stage where we are exploring that this is an innovation. And then maybe once, at the same time, we should explore what's the impact, right? But at the moment, we have been focusing on impact on reflection, the kind of depth of reflections that can be, can emerge. But definitely that needs to be paired with a measure of impact on learning outcomes. The thing is that simulation-based learning, at least in our university, is not assessed summatively. So we don't know if they learn. We don't have a way to learn unless and we have been doing that. We create a pre and post test, but that's more artificial. That's more our thing for research purposes. So yeah, there are multiple things that we can validate, but that's how we have been doing it.
Thanks.
All right, Roberto, I've got 2 questions for you for the chat. I'm actually going to do them in the reverse order because I think one builds to the next, and they're both also methods questions specifically about data capture and analysis. The first is from Edwin Medina, and he noticed the microphone arrays and the lapel mics, but not whether, you didn't talk much about discourse analysis. So what, if anything, did you do with this data? And if not, what was the purpose and resulting analyses of connecting the audio and the data?
Yeah, thanks, Edwin. Yeah, definitely.
And if you want to add to that, feel free.
Yeah, that's a great question. I thought that no one was going to pick it up. No, yeah, we have that data. We have that data. That's for us, it has been the most challenging data. I've been dealing with the microphone array data when I was in my PhD, where you had a microphone array, 3 people sitting around a table, and it was really challenging to get any useful content of the speech. It's much easier to get prosodic moves like the intonation, presence of voice, turn taking, that's okay. But we are very interested in picking up the keywords that the nurses are saying. Similarly, and actually we got that. We haven't done that analysis though, because but we got the keywords that the teacher is expecting the students to say, like certain phrases to communicate with the patient, like how do you feel your pain from 1 to 10. These are things that if we pick certain words, we can actually characterize. The technology to do a conversion from speech to text is improving a lot. We are exploring that. We already run these recordings through algorithms, and it's still not good enough. It works really well when the person is talking with a computer like Alexa, but person to person is still not great. But yeah, we have the data. We haven't gone that deeply into it. But there is a little bit of analysis that we already did. Gloria is actually doing, this current PhD student. So yeah, we don't have now anything, but that's the intention. So I'm disclosing our goals. So if you have any ideas, maybe we can collaborate, and so we need hands for that kind of data as well.
Okay, thank you.
So I'm going to take that question and parlay it into another question that was asked by Matthias about whether you have strategies or suggestions on collecting multimodal data in this kind of context. For example, are you aggregating during the data collection in post-processing, or do you just handle the data as they are? And I think that, you talked about sort of with voice data, the challenges of having to translate it to text. And I think that kind of plays into this as a larger question for anyone thinking about similar situations is, how do you deal with all these multiple data streams at the same time? And I'll add to that question because I've worked with some things. How are you synchronizing them on the time? And Matthias, if you have anything you want to add, and apologies if I've messed up your name to your question, I think that's the scope of it.
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, honestly, we made a trick. We created a tool for synchronization. So we had a bunch of different sensors. We have the positioning sensors. That's the easy one. This is the most automated one. Then we had the empathicas. The empathicas can provide information via Bluetooth dongle, but it was very faulty at the time that we were trying this. So what we did was to create a system outside in which we were synchronizing every little sensor beforehand. So that's not ideal, but it works. So that means it's like recording a movie. We have this how's it called? Oh, there's a name for that. But anyway, we have this clap, let's say, at the beginning. So what's the name, Alicia?
They just say action when they start the movie, so everything starts at the same time, yeah? Yeah,
so we just had a digital one that synchronizes and takes the timestamp when each sensor starts collecting data, or the video and everything. So it's not ideal because in real time, then we cannot show this in real time. What we were doing was showing it after, actually 1 week after. Once that collects, that digital system would get all the little pieces into the same synchronization, and we would create the interface in a nice way. So there is lots of plumbing that still needs to be created. There are some other researchers in multimodal analytics. Javier knows really well at the Clapper work, exactly. That they are working on this plumbing, on this interoperability platform to connect multiple sensors. So there are tools there. At the moment, that's more like a engineering challenge that we didn't want to focus too much on, because that would just need a robust platform that synchronizes everything at the stream. But it's working. What we got is working really well for doing this exploration of data stories. We wanted to focus on the information visualization part, on the user interface part, let's say, rather than trying to solve the whole cycle, which I think that's more like a community challenge. But yeah, there are ways to do it in an easy, lightweight way. And if we want a real-time assessment of the data, not for the debrief, then you need kind of a platform that has all that plumbing working, which is sometimes not sustainable, because then the APIs change, they are updated, and things stop working. That has been always the problem with these interoperability platforms.
Thanks, Roberto. That's a lot of food for thought there.
Yeah.
I'm gonna pass you two more questions from the chat. One is about nursing and the scenarios, and the other is going to talk about sort of the kinds of learning. So the first one is from Sadia, hope I'm getting that right, and she was wondering, were the nurses given some complex scenarios to match with real patients and to see how they responded to unexpected situations? So I think what was sort of the learning setup that the nurses were interacting in the first place? Yeah,
we've been working with 3 or 4, maybe 3 that I remember, 3 different simulations, and they are very authentic. One is a cardiac arrest scenario, when a patient is presenting a cardiac arrest and they need resuscitation. That's the more dramatic one, in which nurses need to do CPR and the patient can actually die sometimes. And they need to deal with that situation. The other 2 are also life and death threatening situations. One is this medication adverse reaction, and another one is a an adverse reaction to anesthetics situation. So yeah, there are very complex scenarios in which they had to go to the medicine room sometimes, they had to bring CPR, ECG devices, use bags, and yeah, so it's really complex. Yeah, but it's a very immersive simulation.
Yeah, that sounds like a lot. So Edwin has a follow-up question, which is about if you have any advice on any aspects of your research that might be applied to assessing and providing feedback to things that are more conceptual in nature and conceptual understanding as opposed to enacting established procedural rules. Or are we not quite there yet? And that actually connects to a question I had, which is, I was amazed that you were able to automate the application of rules for the data storytelling. Like, so, you know, you can show the picture, but then the interpretation, always, we need the humans for that. And the fact that you were able to codify enough things that you could actually annotate what seemed like quite effectively was really impressive. But I also wondered, is it because this is in a domain where it's just really clear you need to do this 5 seconds after somebody crashes? So what does that look like for other domains, which I think ties to the question that Edwin was asking?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I have another student who is not working in the area of learning analytics, who is actually looking more at the conceptual understanding of nurses. So she's the one who's been doing this pre-post tests and so measuring, okay, what happened with the conceptual understanding for this particular scenario. In her case, is pediatrics simulation. But we haven't used any instrumentation in that case. What she did was actually changing the pedagogy, comparing direct instruction, so students know everything about the case beforehand, versus productive failure, which is students just dive deep into the simulation, knowing not much, and then they have the instruction, and then they repeat. And she found like it was great, but that was more like a pedagogical comparison rather than how the analytics can support that. So as Alicia is mentioning, I think this approach works well for domains that are not extremely open and things are expected. So that's why I was mentioning, I think someone called it, this is a kind of signature pedagogy where the debrief is based on certain things that are expected to happen, but other things like the stress levels, there is certain expectations from the teachers, but there are things that just happen as well. So we are talking about not only the conceptual understanding here, but also the affective aspects that teams may be experiencing, and also the procedure, and also the spatial skills. So in the examples I showed, I didn't show much about the space, but that's also important. For example, how the students approach the patient, what are the formations that they make. This is some research that we are focusing on now. So there, I mean, I don't know if we are there yet for conceptual understanding, but if we start getting things about the dialogue, we kind of start to pick information from what nurses are saying and when. And if they show any conceptual understanding, because they need this conceptual understanding to do the procedures, then yeah, maybe we can start making improvements in that area. This is great questions. Yeah.
So I think maybe that's a good place to close, since even though we don't have to move from Zoom room to Zoom room, it's always nice to step up and break between things. I think, Roberto, you got some really interesting and tough questions, and I think the last one exemplified incredibly well both how exciting and impressive what you're able to achieve so far is, and how much more there is to do and how much more is possible. So very exciting, and clearly this is really just the beginning. So thank you very much for sharing with us. Thank you everyone from near NYU and far away for coming, joining us for this talk, and also for some really great questions. We're trying to move away from the webinar, which puts Roberto behind a wall, to open this up so that we can have more of this dialogue, and I think it really paid off. It was fascinating to hear what you guys had to ask and to what Roberto had to say. So with that, I'll close the session. Thank everyone for coming, and hope you join us for another chat and talk again soon. Have a great afternoon, everyone.
Awesome. Thank you.